Professor?
Yeah, my problem is he doesn't make the full screen at the moment.
Ah, okay.
And I cannot
slide there.
He doesn't listen. Okay. Had ik even stop sharing. Nee, wat is het opzet? Normaal dit. Ik wil gewoon full screen. En die doesn't listen. Even kijken. Oh, whatever. View. Open. Ja, hij lijkt dus. Dan moet ik deze doen. Dan moet ik het. Nou moet ik share screen doen. Voor deze dus. Introduction to Sustainability. Is dit? No, I think it's I think dit. Deze is. Ja. Hey. Okay. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Hello. Let's do it like this. I will try to speak relatively slowly. If you don't understand something, if you have a question, raise your hand, ask me the question. Yeah. Questions for understanding. We can have a discussion after the whole talk. It will be a class of, I understand, 2 hours. So we do it in about 45 minutes, then a short break. And also welcome to the people somewhere remotely available. Okay, it's working. Good. I want to talk first about the sustainability challenges that the world faces. And then in the second half of the class, I want to talk about sustainability solutions. But first, I want to ask you a question. It is a teaser. And I want you to compare, just think about. We have here 3 species on Earth. The first species is the reindeer. You don't have reindeers in this part of the world, but in the north of Norway, in the north of Canada, you have animals that look like horses and they graze grass and they live there. Then the second animal is the aardvark. I'm not sure if they are in Indonesia, but they live from, they have a very long tongue and they live from ants. They go to termite hills and they try to harvest the ants. And then we have us. We are called Homo sapiens sapiens. And now I'm going to do something what you may find very tense. I'm going to ask you a question. Who of these 3 species is the most sustainable on Earth? You say Homo sapiens. Any other idea? No idea. You could give the wrong answer. That's not important. Just your thoughts. I give this class also for my students, and many have it wrong, so don't worry. I see it already. You're all a bit afraid. Don't be afraid. Do you think she is right that we humans do a good job in keeping the planet in good shape? Do you think so? I think she is wrong. We have climate change. We have all kinds of things. We do a number of things very wrong. So humans, we are not it. So between the other two, what do you think? Who is the best? Yeah, I think there is no option but to explain the answer. Okay. Candidate one, the reindeer. You have to know that in the Second World War, as you know, Japan was fighting the Americans. And they even conquered a piece of the US near Alaska, a few small islands. And what did the Americans do? They fortified one island, they put military people on it, and they had a radar station to see if the Japanese were coming. And it was also important because the Japanese were supporting the Russians in their war against Germany. And of course, they needed to travel overseas to Russia, between the Pacific and Russia. So what did they do? They put a number of military people on an island, but that was very north. So, you can imagine that maybe in the winter, even the oceans could freeze, maybe ships could not reach them. So these people could be alone for maybe 3 months in the winter. So the idea was, we put a number of reindeer on the island, and if they really got shortage of meat or something to eat, they can shoot some reindeer and eat the reindeer. Okay, 3 years later, the war was over. The reindeer were still on the island, and everybody forgot about the reindeer. And maybe there were only, 29 reindeer on the island in the beginning. But of course, they had no enemies. They could live nicely there. There was a lot of grass. So they multiplied, they multiplied, they multiplied. And around 1960, there were a few thousand, 6,000 according to this figure, 6,000 reindeer. And then all of a sudden, everything collapsed. Yeah, because the reindeer, they ate too much grass. They didn't have enough food anymore. There was inbreeding. Let's say the strength of the reindeer was not good. There were maybe diseases. So what happened there was overpopulation, too much population of reindeer on the island. And bam, all of a sudden, most of the reindeer died. And when researchers came back in the early 1960s, they only found 40 or 50 reindeer. Well, this is the typical thing that happens if you do not exploit your natural resources in a good way. Yeah. The reindeer basically didn't think about it. They could not. They're deer. They cannot think. So they just, behaved like they behaved, and everything went wrong. Then we have the next one, the aardvark. Like I said, what does the aardvark do? Goes to termite hills, eats a lot of termites or ants, and then goes to the next hill. You know what the clever thing about the aardvark is? You can imagine if you have a termite hill full of ants, and you eat all the ants, then again, the hill is destroyed. There is no population anymore, and it cannot be covered. But what this animal is doing, eats only 10 or 15% of the ants in the hill. There is still 85% of the population left. The population is growing again, recovers again, so the hill stays intact. The aardvark goes to the next hill, does the same, 10-15% eats it, the next one. So what the aardvark is doing, they harvest their environment, but they do it in such a way that there is, at the end of the day, the environment can recover. Yeah, and that is the good thing. So this one is doing quite well. And then I don't have to tell you that Homo sapiens is actually doing something very bad at the moment. We create a lot of climate change. In my country, we have now, I would say, almost rain like I'm only used to from the past in, let's say, Indonesia with heavy rains and that kind of things. But our country is not made for it. So we now have this year a lot of farmers, yeah, that are underwater. The crop is a kind of like lost, and so on. If things are going to happen like that, the ice sheet of Greenland is going to melt, my country will be underwater. In your country, Jakarta will be underwater. Yeah, we are not very smart. We are destroying our own habitat. So from the free species, I would say the aardvark is doing well. The reindeers are stupid, and we are almost as stupid as the reindeer. Okay, let me explain a little bit about the challenge. We basically inherited an Earth that was nice, blue, green. I mean, only 100 years ago, this is how the Earth was, you know? There was no pollution. There was no big things that went wrong. But at this moment, the Earth looks more like this, you know, very gray, polluted. Again, go to a big city like Jakarta, like Bangkok, it doesn't matter, you know. It doesn't feel good. And why is that happening? Well, the Earth's natural system is nice and green. We have resources in the Earth crust. We have resources from agriculture. And we have an economy that since the Industrial Revolution actually takes these resources from the Earth, transform that in all kind of goods and products that we use, but does so with a lot of emissions and waste. The point is, if you do that on a small scale, the Earth can cope with it. It is a bit like our bodies. If I have a cold, well, you know, I can recover because a cold is not a very dangerous and very heavy disease. Well, if I have tuberculosis, I need a lot of medication, otherwise I'm not going to survive. Yeah. So that is what's happening with the Earth as well. If you put the system too much under pressure, then things go wrong. If you create a little bit of pressure, things are okay. So what did we do in the last 100, 200 years? We had something like this. We have a very gray economic system that pollutes the Earth, and it became bigger, bigger, bigger. Yeah. 100 years ago, we had maybe 2 billion or 1 billion people on the Earth. Now we have close to 8 billion. All these people live longer. All these people are more prosperous. I can all of a sudden travel maybe 2 times a year to China, to Indonesia. My grandparents could not do that. They almost were living in the same area where they were born. Yeah. So we now have a lot of options, unfortunately, based on fossil fuels and all. And the problems that you face then, in a nutshell, are that we have climate change, that we use a lot of water, up to the point that the fresh water that we now extract in 2030, yeah, we have too much fresh water that we extract. We use almost all the biomass that is produced in nature for food. And of course, you have to leave biomass for animals, for wildlife. We have depleted fish stocks. And we use almost all the arable land for agriculture. So we are facing the limits. Good. Let's talk about sustainability then. The sustainable development concept has been discussed in a lot of international conferences. And what we basically want to have is, on the one hand, that we respect the planetary limits of the environment, that is the top. That at a societal level, we want to provide decent life, justice, and social stability. And at the economic side, you want to have economic growth. Yeah, that are three things that we want to realize with our economic system. That is reflected by the so-called Sustainable Development Goals. That is a set of common goals adopted by all the countries in the world via the UN in 2050. And the idea is that by 2030 we have eradicated poverty, that we have ended hunger, that we have ensured that people have access to healthcare, access to education, and so on. There are 17 of these goals. And they reflect, of course, the three pillars. You know, we have goals that deal with the economy. We have goals that deal with protecting the earth, the environment. And you have goals that deal with the question of how do we give all the people a good life. You see, however, that the goal of sustainable development, you can actually present it in different ways. I already showed the triangle. Yeah, you want to actually make sure that all the goals in the triangle are met, that we all have a good life, that the economy flourishes, and that we do so within planetary limits. But particularly economists say, well, we can make a trade-off. Yeah, we have profit, that is the economic part. We have the planet, that is the ecological part. And we have people, that is the social part. Well, maybe what we could do, if we create more profit, then maybe we can compensate for the fact that the planet is a bit more under pressure. That is a bit that way of looking at things. Frankly, I don't think you can do that. Like I said already, you have to look at the Earth as a natural system that can tolerate some pressure, but if you put the system too much under pressure, and things go wrong. Yesterday, in an overall speech, I compared it with our own bodies. Yeah. If I cross the street here and I don't look very carefully, I can have a terrible accident. Yeah. But if I'm lucky, you go to hospital, and even if I break a leg or break an arm, I can recover after 2 months. Yeah. But if I'm driven over by a big truck, I probably will not survive. It is irrecoverable. Yeah. And that is what you see with the planet as well. Our bodies have a very good capacity of actually deal with damage and confront damage and make yourself healthy again if you're ill. But if the illness is too strong or the accident too big, then you will not come out without any harm. Yeah. So this is actually visualized by an economist called Kate Rayward. And she said what we have to do. On the one hand, we have the planetary limits. We have to make sure that the natural system of the Earth keeps its integrity, that we don't destroy it. Yeah, and that implies that with climate change and biodiversity loss and a few other ones, we can only go so far. We cannot pass certain planetary boundaries. And what Kate Rayward further said, yeah, but we also have social boundaries. I don't have to tell you, in this country, I mean, you do incredibly well. You really raised GDP a lot. Human Development Index goes up a lot. But still, I think it was yesterday, the other professor that has his inaugural speech, he said something of 25 million of the Indonesian people out of the 270 million that we have still live in poverty. That is not acceptable. You want to have a basis. Yeah, you want to have a minimum income that at least you're certain of your food, you know, have a good house, have access to healthcare and other basic stuff. So you want to have this basic, I would say, income for good social performance, but within planetary boundaries. I once put it in an EM report in another figure that's, yeah, it's not really visible, but you basically see that you can divide the Earth's, let's say, what happens on Earth in Earth's natural system and an economic system. What does the economic system do? Extracts resources from the Earth. It processes it through manufacturing into products. The products we use, the mobile phones, the computers, everything that we basically have here around us, that is what we use. And then at some point, this building is not useful anymore, will be destroyed. This mobile phone cannot be used anymore, becomes waste. And in all these processes, we extract resources and we create emissions. Yeah, you just have to look at the traffic here. You know, you have a lot of emissions, and all the time when I'm in big cities like here, you feel a little bit like Kuching and whatever, because the pollution is so, yeah, so strong. But that economic process also gives income to people and creates well-being. Yeah, that's the social pillar. And what we have to do is to make sure that we have to an economic system that creates enough income for people like all of us, creates well-being for all of us, and that the pressures on the environment are not too big. That is basically what we want to realize. Well, what are the implications of this story? What we basically see is that you need an income of about $10,000 per year to have a reasonable life. I mean, that is not as much as I have or many of my colleagues have in the Netherlands. But with €10,000 or $10,000, I mean, then at least you have your basics organized. Yeah. You have access to healthcare. You can send your kids to school. You have a reasonable house. You know, you have your food and all, and you have your sanitation. That is possible with that kind of income. The problem, though, is that in the rich countries, like the 1 billion people that live in Western Europe, in the US, the middle class in China, they already are used to incomes of an average of $50,000. Yeah. And you can imagine, we had just a few times elections in the Netherlands. If there would be a party who says, okay, we all earn now on average in the Netherlands $50,000 a year, let's bring that down to $10,000. A very little chance that that party will be chosen in parliament. No, it's not going to happen. So if you take that seriously, then the challenge looks more or less like the same. In 2010, we had about 1 billion, I would say, rich people for the sake of simplicity on Earth. That is the 500 million people in Europe, the 300 million people in the US, and a few hundred million already in the middle class in Asia and some other places. And let's say that they had an income of $50,000. That is basically something like 50, $50 trillion in terms of income. And then at the time, in a lot of countries, poor people didn't have a lot of income, let's say a few $1,000 a year. So in 2010, we had basically an economy of $60 trillion, an enormous amount of money, but very unevenly divided. What will we have in 2050? Well, of course, China will be one of the rich countries. I don't think if I tell to the leader of China, Xi Jinping, sorry, you have to stop your growth. Don't make your people rich. He will politely smile at me and, of course, not do it. I mean, you know, he is on a path, all these Chinese people are on a path from really, you know, as rich as we in the West. So you can expect by 2050, there will be 2 to 3 billion rich people, equally rich as now in the West. And then all of a sudden, if that is 50K, and it implies that in the West we don't grow anymore, you all of a sudden talk about $150 trillion. Yeah, only for the rich people in 2050. Well, by then you have population growth, something like 9 billion, 10 billion. And let's assume that the 7 billion people that you then have that live in less rich countries, but you say we want to give them that income that gives a good life, the $10,000 per person, then all of a sudden you talk about a global economy of about $250 trillion. Yeah. So between 2010 and 2050, if you want to say, well, we don't take things away from the people who are rich at the moment, or people who are on their path to become rich, and you give all the other people a kind of like a minimum income for a reasonable life, then we have to quadruple the economy of the earth in 50 years, 40 years. Yeah. But then we have an issue. Because if we do climate change, at this moment, we have CO2 emissions around 40 gigatons per year. That must go down to almost zero in 2050. Yeah. So how do we do that? We reduce all the emissions related to fossil fuels while we quadruple the economy. That is something like that for every unit of production, every dollar that we produce, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions must go down maybe even a factor of 20. That is an incredible challenge. And with water, you see similar things. We have problems because we have invested in power plants and a fossil fuel infrastructure. I think, Victor, you do one good thing. You have an electric bike. That is wonderful. But I know that your car is still on petrol. And it is a quite new car. Well, you don't want to throw it away next year, buy an electric car. You will drive your car for another 10 years, hopefully, yeah, because it's a good car. So it takes time to replace what we have that emits a lot of carbon by new technology and new infrastructure that has a low emission. Yeah, okay. Continue? Okay, good. But of course, if you have a question, don't hesitate. That is all fine. And in many ways, what we saw in the last 200 years is that the population growth, and you see similar figures for economic growth and gross domestic product growth, looks like this. Yeah. I think this goes back to the year zero when the Romans were in power. Yeah. You see that until I would say, the year of 1600, we had hardly population. And it's only since 1800 that we go like this. Look back at the picture of the reindeer. That also looked like this, but then it went like that. Yeah. So this is a kind of like weird. We have never seen it in history that you could have this kind of growth. It has to go at some point like this on a finite planet. And of course, there are a lot of people who say, yeah, no, we don't want to have that. You know, the economy has been growing now for hundreds of years. And why cannot we continue that for a lot of time? Because in a way, you know, people have a point. I think there was a very famous bet 40 years ago between an environmental person and an economic person who said, the environmental person, of course, said, well, in 20 or 30 years, we will need so many resources, and the resources will be so depleted that the prices of resources will go up a lot. And the other person said, no, that is not true. We have so many resources, and technology will so much improve that we can extract the resources in a way that they are cheaper. Guess who won the bet? The economist. Yeah, I think 10 years ago, resources like steel, aluminium, and so on actually were cheaper than 30, 40 years before. But the problem is that is only on a very short time frame. You know, we have to look at hundreds of years, not 10 or 30 years. So I did a very simple calculation. The calculation was as follows. That, okay, we have to go to carbon neutral technology. At this moment, from the sun, we get 8,000 more a level of energy influx from the sun that is 8 times more than we use at the moment from fossil resources. Well, that sounds great, isn't it? We use like this, and you have 8,000 more. So there seems a huge kind of difference. If we only harvest a little bit of solar power that the sun gives us, we are okay. But let's now make a very little calculation. Let's assume that we pursue with the world 7% growth per year. I think that is what your country did in the best years. That is what China has been doing in the last 20 years. That is what my country has been doing in the 1960s. And my politicians still look back like that was a good period, that we now only have 2%, that's nothing. Okay, if you have 10 years, 70% growth, that is interest on interest, that is roughly you double your economy. Yeah. Let's now make a very simple calculation. So in 10 years, you double your economy if you have 7% growth. Yeah, it is roughly 7 times 10, that is 70%. But since you have your economic students even right, interest on interest, it roughly doubles. What do we have after 20 years? That is 2 times 2. That is 4 times as big. What do we have after 30 years? That is 2 times 2 times 2. That is 8 times as big. After about 35 years, we have grown our economy tenfold. 35 years, tenfold. That is what China literally did in the last 35 years. 35 years is 10 times as big. 70 years is 100 times as big. 105 years is 1,000 times as big. Oh, all of a sudden, the 8,000 times of solar power and the energy we
I'm sorry for Mr. Fatan. Could you please mute your speaker? Or is there any question do you want to ask? Okay, I think he just forgot to mute. Okay.
So what I try to prove with this example, if you pursue economic growth of 7% a year for a bit more than a century, and you want to actually power that economy with solar power, you need to put on the earth the whole surface solar cells that are 100% efficient, and you need to put it on the water on everywhere. Well, that is not possible. So for me, that is proof that somewhere in the next 100 years, we will see that, okay, we have this growth, but it has to flatten. There is no way around it. And you can do the same exercises with water, with materials, and it lasts a bit longer or shorter. And maybe we only have 2% economic growth, and then it lasts maybe 200 years until we hit the limits. But we will hit the limits at some point. Okay, having said that, the challenges really are different per type of country. We have, as I already indicated, the rich consumer economies like Western Europe, the US, maybe the middle class in China. What they have to do is what we call radical decoupling. You know, I still heat my house with gas. That has to go with clean electricity and a heat pump. I really need to go to 0 emissions for heating my house. I don't have a car, so that is good. But all the transport I have to do should be based on carbon neutral means. I do that quite well with my bike. I use trains that are powered by wind energy. The one bad thing I do is I fly too much. Yeah, but okay, that is the challenge that consumer economies have. Then you have the countries that were once called bottom of the pyramid countries, but I would say that are the poorest countries in the global south. Many countries in, let's say, Africa. There we have to make sure that there is economic growth, that basic needs, this $10,000 per person per year, has to be realized. Yeah. And what you hopefully can do in countries like yours that really are developing, that you leapfrog. Yeah. What China is doing very well, they build high-speed trains between the big cities. That can really reduce transport by airplanes. Okay, Victor and I had an experience with the bush, and of course, at this moment, it's fabulous that you have it, but things are to be improved, of course. Yeah, I think that we had to take a cab 45 minutes from central Jakarta to the bush station in Halim. Then in 30 minutes, we were, where was it? In the suburb of, yeah, that one. And then we had to change to a small commuter train to go to Bandung Central. So I think tomorrow I will take the slow train, the normal train to come here because, the time is, and so on. But you can imagine if you have the money to expand the whoosh to Soekarno-Hatta on the one hand, and the whoosh from Bandung to Surabaya and so on, then all of a sudden you guys can use an electric train, and if that is powered by wind power, PV, and whatever, you don't need the airplanes anymore. We call that leapfrogging. That you go to a new technology without using the bad fossil fuel based technologies that we use basically in the West. Yeah. So this is the broad strategies how different parts of the world can become, I would say, more carbon neutral and so on. So in a way, the challenge is really big. Eradicating poverty and keeping wealth at the current levels in the rich OECD countries is really difficult. You have this challenge of moving to a 250 trillion economy while reducing emissions. So you make your economy bigger and you want to reduce emissions. That is really a challenge. So the only real solution is that you really improve your processes of making all kinds of things in the world. I personally think we in the West should stop growth. We should not become richer anymore. That doesn't make any sense. I have a very good life. I'm not a millionaire. I'm not, let alone a billionaire like Bill Gates or whatever. But I have a very good life. Yeah. So I don't need more money. And what you really have to do is make sure that the global south, and particularly the poorest countries in the global south, can grow and that they can give their people a good life. The problem with this, however, is that our economy is built for more. Yeah. You may know that 10 years ago we had a big problem with particularly Greece and some other countries in the south of Europe. These countries had taken up a lot of loans and could not actually pay it back. Then the EU came in and the International Monetary Fund came in and they said, now you really have to pay back. And the only thing what the Greek government could do is cut back salaries of officials, raise taxes, and fire people. You know what happened then? Then you get a spiral down. The problem is that automatically the whole economy is built on improving your performance. Yeah. So if I own a big company, let's say like Unilever, I push my managers to become more efficient a few percent every year. That implies that you lay off. If you don't grow, you have to kick out, let's say, 1 or 2% of your people per year. These people then don't get an income. These people in my part of the world rely on social security. That implies that the taxes have to go up because otherwise we cannot pay social security. Social security gives you less income as with a normal job. If I still have a job and I have to pay more taxes, I can buy less. If I buy less, then Unilever even sells less products. They have to lay off more people. And you get actually something that's spiraling down. Our economy can only be stable if we compensate efficiency growth by the growth of the economy. Yeah. If Unilever becomes more efficient and every company more efficient 2% per year, we can only keep the same amount of jobs if we grow 2%. Well, I just explained to you, eternal growth is not possible. Yeah. 7% a year in 100 years implies using all the solar power. So we have a system that doesn't work. Yeah. So we don't, at this point, know how to create a steady state of something. Okay, this is the part of the bad news. We have a big problem out there. I think I was talking for 45 minutes, so this is actually a good moment to have a break of 15 minutes and that we come back at 11 o'clock, I believe. Yeah? Okay. And of course, if you now have questions, you also can ask questions, but I think you all are very shy and need a little bit of tickling, that kind of thing. Don't hesitate.
So just writing the summary of what you have been speaking about. So I think, is there any question from this room or might be from the Zoom? Is there any question before we taking a break? Okay, for the material, we will set it out. We will blush it out for the material. Is there any question for the first part? Okay. 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 So please introduce yourself and what is your question?
Okay, thank you, Miss Novi, for the chance. Uh, Hello, Mr. Arnold. First, I want to introduce myself. My name is Lutfia. Thank you for the materials that you present to us. I'm sure that we agree that this is very important topic because this is directly related to our lives. I get the point that we must keep balancing our behavior, attitude, and ego because I see the most environmental problem happen because of the ego of the human. So I want to ask a question. How can we assess environmental factors that can be measured by market values, and how can we integrate these assessments into development planning? Thank you.
Say market values
Yes.
and how to include it in development planning. Yeah, in a way, I would almost say many things are relatively simple. Economists know for long that climate change gives external problems. Yeah. So what we try to do in Europe is actually taxing CO2 emissions. Yeah. So what you can do with the economic system is that you say you put taxes on things that are bad for the environment, for instance. Yeah, that is one thing. The other thing that you can do at this moment, you have these huge differences in income. In the US in the 1950s, you used to have a system that if you were Bill Gates or a very rich person, you probably paid 70% or 80% taxes. Yeah. So if you were a millionaire, then you could become a millionaire. But to become a billionaire, then most of the money would go to the state. And the state then used it to help the more poor people, you know, that kind of things. Let's say that you have a tax break if you buy a house, that kind of things. So you have all kind of policies that can help to make the social system more fair and to punish people that pollute the environment. And now you get a big problem. What you saw in the last 30, 40 years, and it started in the 1980s. You had Mrs. Thatcher in the UK, you had Reagan in the US. They said the free market is actually the best for everything. Yeah. And they abolished all kind of high taxes for the rich. You could not talk about taxing pollution. That was impossible because the market solved it. Here we are now. You see that the richest people in the world, they know how to evade taxes and whatever. So they actually, in the US, they have calculated now that the average citizen that has an average income has higher taxes than the billionaires, which is very weird, which is very unfair. The same applies with carbon taxes and that kind of things. My uncle worked with Shell, a big oil company. And I think 20, 30 years ago, once in a while, they said, oh yeah, we go into wind power, into solar power, and so on. That did not really work well because they were an oil and gas company. They know everything about drilling and they were very and so on. Do you know what happens now? They have a new director. They see that their money is being made with fossil fuels. And they now flatly say, we are going to drill for more fossil fuels. We're going to lobby for using more fossil fuels. So what you see is actually in the political scheme, a big fight between things that you and I would say, this is logical, this is how you build a fair and sustainable world. But the people who at this moment profit from the unfair and the unsustainable world, they have a lot of money, they fight very hard, and they block all these measures. And that is, I think, a big problem at the moment. I think we know quite well how to build a fair economy and how to build a sustainable economy. But at this moment, you live in a time where there's a real big fight between the people who profit from it and the people who want to actually go to this fair and sustainable.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Want to add? It's all done? Okay.
That's not
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Rianto. I want to ask about the before I ask, I want to ensure that the sustainability has an important to our our future in the art and our country. I want to specific question in the industry, specifically in the textile industry. Uh, we facing we facing many problem in the industry, and we assure that industry have a strategic contribution for the economic development. In this specific sector, I want to ask about the textile industry. Textile industry is one of the industry and have a contribution for the economic development in the Indonesia. So I want to ask, what's your opinion about the textile industry in the future? About the sustainability in the textile industry, have an economical successful and environmental acceptable and socially acceptable and environmental friendly. Mr. Thanks.
Okay, so it's about the textile industry and how we can basically make a contribution. It is clear the textile industry is very important in this part of the world. I actually will give an example of technological solutions, because one of the big problems with the textile industry is that you want, I mean, this shirt, you know, I think it's cotton, and cotton is normally kind of white, grayish. You have to color it. Okay, how do we do that? With watery baths, with indigo or something else. And then when the bath is spent, you let it go to a river. You have toxic materials in the river. That's not good. I will show there are technologies, if you use supercritical carbon, where you can actually dye shirts like this in a way that you have no losses. If you can apply these technologies, that is really so much better, because then you don't have toxic emissions and that kind of things. Then there are two other problems with the textile industry. The problem with textile at the moment is that we have what we call fast fashion. When you go back to the age of my grandparents, I think my grandfather had 3 sets of clothes. The one was a good set of clothes for the Sunday, for going to weddings and whatever. Then he had his working clothes and some spare one. That was it. And when you were 18 or 20, you got your good suite, yeah, and you were supposed to do with it for the rest of your life, yeah. Maybe here in Indonesia it's still like that. I don't know. Okay, at this moment I don't have the trouser that we had a few days ago. I have a very nice suit that if I go to an official party, I have a blue suit with a blue jacket. Okay. It doesn't wrinkle. So I bought it in a CNA, that is a big retailer. And I bought it because you know, it's so good for traveling and that kind of. You know what the little problem was? After 1 or 2 years, the fabric was so thin here that after 1 or 2 years, you see a hole in the fabric. Only after 1 or 2 years. The jacket was good. The rest of my trousers was good. Luckily, CNA was still selling it, so I could buy basically my next suit. And 3 years ago, I even saw that I could buy, because they want to kick it out, I still had a trouser, you know. But I think this is normally, even if you don't want to use it for 30 years, I should be able to use my trousers for 6 or 8 years. It's just a matter of making it a little bit sturdier on this part. That doesn't cost a lot. Let's say I pay 200 euros for the suit. Making that part a bit sturdier is 202 euros. Nothing wrong. You know what the problem is? If I all of a sudden use the suit for 6 years rather than 2 years, the retail shop has to fire 2/3 of its people. If it would be made in Indonesia, the factory would fire 2/3 of the people, and so on. So, in a way, I understand that they make the suits in such a way that I have to buy every 2 years something new. You know, I have the money, so and so on. But if you think a little bit further, it would be much better that I, let's say, pay 500 or 550 euros for the suit that I can use for 6 years. I'm still better off. I pay 50 euros less in 6 years. And then the money goes to the people of CNA. The money goes to the people working in the factory. And it's win-win-win because I have my suit still for 6 years for less money. And we can all produce it with less effort. You know what the problem is? This is not how, let's say, the textile company in Indonesia can make money. They cannot force it, you know? So again, we have a stupid thing in the economic system that forces us to actually make obsolete things that become very quickly obsolete. So that is one issue. And we can only solve that by changing a bit the economic rules of the system. And then, of course, you have the other point is that I don't know how it is in Indonesia these days. But yeah, I think in Bangladesh we had 6 or 8 years ago a big accident with a lot of people being buried in a factory. You know, you have people working there for 12 or 14 hours a day and that kind of things. And you don't want that. You want to actually making the change that we made already 100 years ago, that we had child labor, we had too long days. At some point it went really to 40 or 48 hours working. And we implemented minimum wages that were enforced. So I think that are the kind of things that have to be done. And then of course someone has to make the clothes. So if you are that is good. I hope it answered.
Oh,
Yeah.
any further question? Oh, that is enough. Is all clear? Okay, it sounds clear. Okay, is there any question from this room or even from the Zoom? Okay. Okay, if there is not the question, I think we'll have the break right now, like for the 15 minutes.
Yeah, I think 15 minutes. So then we start because I think we now almost are 11. So 11:50 is that a good time?
Okay, I think 15 minutes is good. Okay, let's start our break. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I see. Okay, but yeah.
Okay, everyone, we are going to start again, continue again. So please be ready. And for Professor, I think you can start for the part 2.
He didn't share. And he doesn't show. Yeah, that's what I do. Oh, no, I did one. Good. Yeah, I can start. Okay, we're going to look for solutions. Do you see it's always the same? When I ask a question, nobody talks. But when there's been a good. Okay. There has been a very famous series of papers by Johan Rockström, Will Steffen, and some other people in Nature and Science, and they actually made a follow-up paper where they looked at planetary boundaries. And they said, well, where we have trouble is climate change, biodiversity, fresh water use, nitrogen and phosphorus emissions, and toxic emissions. And that is only at a global scale. But of course, at a local scale, you also have other things like noise pollution, air pollution in cities due to traffic, all these kind of things. So again, we get here the same picture that you've already showed a few times. And we have a number of things that are related to the extraction and the use of natural resources, and a number of things that are related to emissions. Let me go to a number of these problems and what causes these problems. Let's talk about climate change. Here you see, with regard to climate change, let's say in the figure, a number of emissions and sources of that and types of emissions. So you see that most of the problems with climate change, they are created. Sorry. Yeah, you have to put it out. I think go because you know he can sit next to with the dog. So you see a lot of the problems are related to CO2 from energy, land use change, and so on. And the common wisdom is that, yeah, I mean, we still have some 500 to 1,000 gigaton of emission room left until we surpass the threshold that the temperature will rise more than 1.5 or 2 degrees. And at this moment, we basically emit 42 gigatons per year. So if you believe the lower level is relevant, we only have 10 or 12 years to go on with the type of emissions that we have today. The main contributors of these emissions are, it is heat and power, particularly power. Electricity generation is now for a lot of the world done with coal-fired power plants. In China, I understand in this part of the world as well. Although I also heard that you want to decommission a coal-fired power plant and replace it by somewhere else. A lot of emissions are caused by agriculture in two ways. If you have animal husbandry, yeah, these animals, they emit CH4, methane. That is a powerful greenhouse gas. But also indirectly, you can imagine if you have a rainforest area and you convert that into grassland, all of a sudden, the capacity to store carbon in the trees and the leaves goes down a lot. Yeah. So if you have, let's say, forest land that can absorb a lot of carbon, if you are going to use it for agriculture, the absorption capacity is much less. Then we have 2 or 3 industries that are really, I would say, problematic. If we make steel, we have to reduce iron ore, and we use for that, let's say, cokes, which basically is made of fossil fuels. Yeah, and At this moment, you see some experiments that we do it with hydrogen, but we are not that far yet. When you look at cement, and that is a real issue in this part of the world. I mean, the problem with cement is we basically dig up calcium carbonate from the soil. We heat it until very high temperatures with all kinds of fossil fuels. That creates emissions. And then the calcium carbonate decomposes in calcium oxide or calcium hydroxide and CO2. Yeah. If you just go to China, I mean, they built these high-speed railways, which are perfect for reducing the amount of flying. But I think between Shanghai and Beijing, if you have to build a high-speed rail there, they have built a bridge. You know, all these with the Wuxi, it's the same. You know, they are on concrete pillars and whatever. They need an amount of cement that is incredible. And at this moment, we do not know yet how to make cement that is carbon neutral. The whole chemical industry near where I live, Rotterdam Harbor, we have a chemical industry that is based on refineries, fossil fuels to convert to other chemicals. Aluminum. If you have bauxite and you want to make aluminum from it, you need a lot of electricity. Paper, you know. So all our processes are basically emitting these kind of carbon emissions. When you go to water scarcity, I would say the picture looks like this. The common wisdom is that we need water for basically agriculture. 70% of the fresh water in the world is used in agriculture. We use it to cool power plants. We use it in industry and we use it in households. So particularly in my country, you know, you have these things like you brush your teeth and then, you know, the tap water is still running while brushing. Then you have to fight between the man and the woman in the house, like, you have your tap open for while brushing your teeth. You can brush your teeth and have the tap closed. Or the man retaliates and says, you take a shower of 15 minutes and I only 5 minutes. Well, that is amount of water, only 10% is used in the house. Eh? That is not a lot. Of course, it's clean water. That is different as we use for agriculture. But the real culprit with water use is agriculture. That is the big thing at the moment. And we see in the picture that we have there on the map, the red areas are areas where we expect water shortage in, let's say, the next 10 years or something like that. And there are areas where you would expect that, like Africa with the Sahara, and of course Saudi Arabia and the deserts in Australia. But we are also going to see that in China and in northern Mexico and that kind of things. Well, which is not good. But the main message here, agriculture is really the thing that we have to address with water. Then we have biodiversity loss. This is a picture of the world, what is it? The WWF. They make every year the Living Planet report. And they looked how many species were living on a square meter in 1970 on average in different continents, like Europe, North America, and other parts of the world. Well, in Europe and North America, things didn't decline that much. I think because we already in 1970 had cut most of the forest and had transformed most of our land already to agricultural land. So there wasn't too much anymore to decline. Unfortunately, you see in the Asia Pacific and Latin America, there are huge declines. And it all has to do with particularly the Amazon rainforest. You know, people cut it down, they transform it to agricultural land that creates the soybeans and whatever that are fed to the intensive animal husbandry in my country. And also here, the reasons for biodiversity loss are pretty clear. Land use change is on top of that. That is not a surprise. If you cut rainforest in Kalimantan and you do something else with it, you lose biodiversity. It's as simple as that. We have problems with invasive species related to climate change, but also due to other things. I think I don't know, craved, yeah, whatever. We have now in Dutch canals, we have a species that came in by international trade, ships and whatever. And yeah, they freed themselves somehow, and now we have American kind of like animals in our Dutch waters, and you know, somehow they don't have natural enemies and whatever that chases things. And of course, water extraction and pollution are also not good for biodiversity. Fisheries, we know that particularly in my part of the world, I mean, I think if you went out 80 years ago with a small boat, you really could fish a lot. Now we have become so apt with sonar and whatever. We know to see the fish and whatever, and we have overfished. And the fish population really has declined with 70, 80%. So being a fisher in my country is not good anymore. And we try to do an alternative with aquaculture, but yeah, that is often not an easy way of doing it. If you have salmon farms in Norway, for instance, you have to feed them with fish because salmon are a predator. Yeah, you have very concentrated amounts of salmon in these kind of fish farms, and you have to put all kind of antibiotics in them to keep them healthy. Yeah, okay. In a fish farm, the antibiotics spread over the water. You have emissions, and even resources. I would say with resources like iron ore, bauxite, copper ore, zinc ore, I think we will not face scarcity in the next 20 or 30 years. I mean, there is enough of that kind of material. As long, of course, we don't want to grow the economy 1,000 times in 100 years, then we will have problems. The real problem is to mine these materials and make the metal out of it. We need an enormous amount of carbon emissions at the moment with the current process. What is already becoming a problem are the minor metals, lithium, cobalt, neodymium, and so on. If you have a mobile phone like this, yeah, how thick is it? Not even a centimeter. Still, the loudspeaker in this mobile phone, if I put it on maximum, you probably can hear it at the end of the room. That is amazing. The loudspeaker needs to have a magnet that is very, very strong. Well, these magnets you only can make with neodymium and boron. Yeah. And that is with a lot of magnets like that. If you want to have a small, powerful magnet, you need that material. If you want to have LED light bulbs, you need indium. If you want to have car batteries, Victor did a nice study on electric vehicle batteries. Yeah, if you want, you need nickel, you need lithium, you need cobalt, because that's how the batteries are made. If you then look where these metals are mined, cobalt, the Democratic Republic of Congo is the biggest source of cobalt. If you go to that country, it is a failed state. You probably have to go to a province where warlords are reigning. Yeah, I mean, you have to bribe these people and whatever. That is not a very stable supply. Yeah? And then the other problem is that neodymium and some other stuff. We had sources in the US, we had sources in Australia, but the Chinese could provide that cheaper 20, 30 years ago. So all the people in the West said, oh, the Chinese give us that cheaper, and the mines could not compete anymore. The mines closed. I found reports of the US Geological Survey. Take care. The Chinese now have the power. And the first 10 years, there was no problem, but the Chinese were happy to sell the stuff. But the Chinese were developing very quickly. They have become one of the biggest producers of mobile phones. They have become the biggest producer of car batteries, electric vehicle batteries. They saw we need these materials for our production. They started to reduce exports. And then all of a sudden, Europe and the US woke up like, oh. And now, of course, China is seen as the big enemy. You know, we have a geopolitical struggle between the US and China. And everybody is all of a sudden, oh, we did some stupid things 20, 30 years ago. Yeah. Well, okay, that is typically how I would say policy in the West is done. if you have a short-term profit, you take the short-term profit and you don't think about the consequences of 20, 30 years. The Chinese are much more clever. They thought about this 20, 30 years ago. They made sure that they had the mines. They bought the patents for the batteries or the magnets from the Japanese. They are the biggest producer now. If you look at China, they really have a plan. They dominate now PV, they dominate wind, they dominate EV, and so on. And it implies that there is a kind of resource scarcity because we cannot really access all the materials in countries that are open to us. I think Indonesia, Victor, is playing a bit of the same game with nickel. You're the biggest nickel producer in the world. So what very smartly is being done, if a nickel mine is opened in Australia, all of a sudden you dump the prices, and then the nickel mine in Australia goes bankrupt, and you're the biggest supplier again. You know, that are the kind of games that are being played. Okay, that all looks very complicated. Let me give you one success story where the world really acted in time to really prevent a big thing. I'm not sure if you still recall that because that is actually something from my generation. In the 1980s, in the 1990s, we saw all of a sudden we have an ozone layer around the Earth. Ozone, that is O3, that is oxygen, but actually with 3 oxygen atoms in it. The normal oxygen is O2 that we breathe. And the interesting thing is because we have the ozone layer, the sun actually gives a lot of very hard ultraviolet light towards the Earth. I mean, if we are exposed to that, you would have probably within half a year, you would have skin cancer, that kind of things. Very dangerous. But since we have the ozone up in the atmosphere, this ultraviolet light bumps on the ozone layer, and the ozone is actually decomposed in O2 and something else. And by that, the radiation doesn't reach the surface. So that is why we can actually live here and walk here. And if you protect yourself a little bit, you don't have to be too afraid of skin cancer. But the problem was that all of a sudden satellites discovered that the amount of ozone in the upper atmosphere was declining very quickly, particularly over the South Pole. And then we became afraid. We were like, oh, if we lose the ozone layer, then all of a sudden we have massive health effects for all the citizens of Europe. And we found out that a chemical that we used in refrigerator, CFCs, chlorinated fluorocarbons, that they were the culprit. They were very stable, of course. If your refrigerator, that is a closed system, but at some point it goes to waste, escapes. And these CFCs went into the atmosphere, reacted with ozone, and declined the ozone layer. And then I think within 5 years, there were negotiations, and we found a solution, the Montreal Protocol. What was the solution? We banned the CFCs. We replaced them with other chemicals that were less harmful for the ozone layer. And in a way, that was it. We see now that the ozone layer recovers. We have to realize ourselves, however, that there were a number of things that worked in favor of this solution. First, nobody would escape if the ozone layer would be gone. That you would have a health problem. It would affect me as a relatively rich person. It would affect Bill Gates as a billionaire. It would affect all of us. There is no protection unless you start to live underground, which is not a very nice prospect. So both the rich and the poor all had basically an incentive to do something about it. We could show pictures like this. You know, the satellites made nice pictures. So the problem was immediately clear for everyone. Yeah, everybody believed it. And we didn't yet have all these things like Twitter and whatever, and where you have fake news and whatever. That wasn't as strong at that point. And the trust in science was still. And the most important thing was that who made these chemicals? Well, one of the major producers was a chemical company called DuPont. And they could very easily make the alternative chemicals. So what they could do is actually turn around their factories to new chemicals. If everybody would have complied with rules, okay, they lost their CFC business, but everybody, any competitor would lose it. And they were guaranteed that their new chemical had a good market. So there was no reason for them to really say, well, yield digging, that kind of things. If you compare that with climate change, if I'm the director of Shell and my turnover relies for 95% on selling oil and gas, I am lost when the whole world is using wind, PV, or maybe nuclear. I don't have a business anymore. I face an existential threat. So of course I'm going to fight back. In this case, the big industries had no reason to fight back because they could be part of the solutions. Good. Let's now go to how to solve issues. What is very important to solve environmental problems is that you have to look from production to consumption. Because why is that? Consumption drives production. Yeah. There is now a huge debate about palm oil with Indonesia. You are the biggest producer of palm oil in the world. My PhD, Ilan, who is actually from UNPAD, now does a number of calculations what is happening. And yes, if the amount of palm oil that we use in the world is going to double until 2030, that inevitably will imply that we use more land for palm oil production. But what a lot of people forget is that palm oil production per square meter is highly efficient. If you say we stop using palm oil and you go to say rapeseed or sunflower oil, the amount of land that you use may be much higher. Yeah. So we all have to look. So, I mean, the only solution, if you want to say, I reduce the amount of palm oil, is literally consuming less. That is the consumption-based perspective. But maybe there is another solution at the production side. If you can actually have more intensive cultivation of palm oil estates, then you can actually produce more palm oil on less ground, and you don't have to cut your rainforest. Yeah. So you basically have solutions on the production side and the consumption side. And to make it a little bit more sophisticated, it is also about how we design our products. Victor, in many ways, I'm very proud of you. You have a small car, which is good. But I see a lot of people in Indonesia, in my country, whatever, if they buy a car, they buy a very big one, an SUV. Well, it's very simple. If you have to buy an SUV, more materials, more petrol. If I do it electric, bigger battery. Well, let's design our stuff in such a way that it is small and small enough to fulfill our needs. The other example is the suit I talked about just when I was answering the question of that gentleman there. If I design a suit that I have to replace every 2 years, that is bad. If I design a suit that I only have to replace every 6 years, you actually save a lot of materials. So design matters. Then you have the use of products and services. Victor's car is still driven by him. We are giving a lecture here. The car is standing idle in the parking lot. It doesn't do anything. I just came across a very interesting news feature that in China, Beijing, they are now capable of organizing self-driving cars. That would be terrific. Victor would not own his car anymore, or maybe you own it. But let's assume it is a self-driving car. You have a nice app, a bit like Grab. And someone is saying, I need a car for the next hour while we are giving the lecture. Well, Victor says, yes. Pay, I don't know, a few 100,000 rupees. Yeah. The interesting thing is that the person renting the car of Victor doesn't even own car anymore, and you intensify the use of the car. That implies maybe it is still as busy on the road as it is today, but the amount of cars that you need is much less. More energy. Yeah.
I'm sorry, for Mr. Ilham Nugraha, could you please mute your microphone, please? Ilham Nugraha. Anyone who have unmuted? Saiful, please, could you please mute your microphone? Saiful.
Yeah, it's okay. Good. And then, of course, the way how we consume is also important. I will come back to that later. Okay, let's now first, go to the production perspective. I already indicated that carbon emissions come mostly from power, transport, heating, cement, steel, bulk chemicals, and agriculture. What can we do about? Make sure that energy efficiency is really very good. My brother lives in an old house. Well, I mean, he has to really pay a lot to his energy company to heat his house. I bought 10, 15 years ago a quite modern house. It is not zero energy, but I really need not a lot of gas to heat my house because it's very well insulated and so. I think here in this part of the world, you more have to think about natural cooling and that kind of things. I think you have very nice examples in Iran. I think buildings that are more than 1,000 years old and that somehow use, very cleverly natural wind creation and whatever, by which you don't need a lot of air conditioning. The traditional way of, let's say, the modern way of building is you don't care. You just put in a building in place and then you correct everything with air conditioning, which implies that you pay a lot for your electricity. But I'm pretty sure if you think about it, you can build houses in a way that they don't need a lot of energy. And of course, the same applies for chemical production, steel production. I mean, you can have very inefficient plants and you can have very efficient plants. Of course, we have to use low carbon technologies like wind, PV, electric vehicles. For steel production, we see now in Sweden the first successful experiments that we can reduce steel with hydrogen that is made by wind power. Well, it's a bit more expensive as the normal steel. But you can imagine if I use the steel in a car, well, the car is maybe 20,000 euros or $20,000. The amount of steel that you use is a few $100s. If the steel is $100 or $150, at the end, for the price of the car, that is just a minor thing. Yeah. So hopefully we can solve that. If you go to water extraction, I already indicated agriculture is responsible for 70% of the amount of agriculture water use. So what you want to see there is much more efficient irrigation, like drip irrigation. You can use artificial intelligence, you can use monitoring, you can look which plants really are in need of water and which not, and you actually will reduce the amount of water that you use for irrigation. You can also think about crops with lower water requirements. Land use, there the big culprit is agriculture. So can we think about using our land more intensively for agriculture? Maybe we can look at urban farming. Maybe we can even look at mixed farming, like food forests, that you don't have the monocultures that we now have in most Western parts. With material use, if we have stronger materials, I give there an example of the use of high-strength steel in a car. The red part are high-strength steel. I once was in a seminar with a CEO of a steel company, and he said, Arnold, we can now make steel that is so strong that if we rebuild the Eiffel Tower in Paris, we can do that with half the amount of steel because it's much stronger. Yeah. So material science can really be a help to reduce the amount of material use. We probably need to use simpler materials. Yeah, I think this computer already has 5 types of plastics in it. If I put it in a shredder, I have to separate the 5 types of plastics. That's difficult to reuse. If I can go down to 1 type of plastic, that is much easier. And of course, more efficient use of materials. And then I go to the example of dyeing. I give there the example dyeing with supercritical CO2. It looks a bit like a washing machine. You put supercritical CO2 with, let's say, blue colorant, indigo in it, and you put your cotton in it as well, and you wash it, but not with water, with supercritical CO2 and indigo. And then you have a little bit of losses of CO2, but in the end, you have a blue fabric and a residue of indigo that you can leave in for the next batch. You don't have losses. And that is a real big difference compared to dyeing in the traditional way, where you have a bath with indigo, the spent bath has to go somewhere. Often in this part of the world, you don't have water treatment, so it pollutes the river. Yeah, so it's more efficient, less emissions. Then let's go to design solutions. What you want to have is design solutions that expand the life of the product. I didn't give the example here, but I already talked about my suit and my trousers that had a life of 2 years. If you make it a bit sturdier, the same trousers can live for 6 years. Yeah, I have the same surface with much less material. The other thing that you want to do is make it repairable. Don't try that with this mobile phone. It is glued. I cannot do anything anymore. The battery is actually stuck. It becomes bad after every 2 years. I have to really go to a repair shop. The repair shop can replace the battery. It cost me 60 euros. It's ridiculous. Well, from this one, that is an old one, I can actually replace the battery myself. Yeah, you want to have repairable products that can live much longer. If you really think very carefully, you can probably look at components of your product, like, I don't know, maybe the screen of this mobile. When the mobile is really done, maybe I can reuse the screen in a new mobile. And only then you want to have recycling, that you maybe put this mobile phone in the shredder and you try to recover the individual components. So we have a very famous example in the Netherlands called Fairphone that is totally different as Samsung or all the other phone makers. What they do, you actually can replace all the components yourself. So this old mobile phone doesn't have a very good camera. If you say you want to have a better camera, well, you can actually click out the camera, go to the Fairphone website, you order a new camera with more megapixels, and you click it in again, and you have a better phone. Yeah. The other thing what you can do, think about, is that if you are a producer of, let's say, mobile phones or copiers or whatever, that you think about the components in the current generation of products, and that you think already in 5 years, I want to put a new product on the market that is maybe better, because that is what's happening with mobile phones. They become better all the time. But maybe I then can reuse certain components where the innovation doesn't go that fast. So you think already about the design of the product in 5 years, and you make sure that the components in the old products from the first generation products can be reused in the next generation. And so on. So these are kind of tricks where designers really look at using less materials, by that using creating less emissions. Now I come to business model solutions. There is a reason why Samsung makes the phone like this. This phone, unless I bring it to a repair shop, is after 2 or 3 years obsolete. They hope I buy a new one. Actually, do you know why I had to buy this one 5 years ago? I had a very good Samsung Galaxy 2. You know what my bank said? We go to a new system. It is not good enough to log in anymore with your username and the passport on the website. You also get a code via the bank app. So I need a bank app on my mobile phone. I was trying to do that with my old mobile phone, Galaxy 2. And then, of course, I had Android 2 or 3 on my mobile phone. And the app did not work with Android 2 or 3. So if I would have continued to use the old phone, that still was perfectly good, I could not bank anymore. I had to buy something like this at that. And why is that? Samsung can sell more phones. Okay. What basically some companies now are trying to do is actually not selling you the product anymore, because then the profit can only be made by selling more products and more products and more products. They say per unit of use, you pay per unit of use. Copiers are a very good example. So you see there a little picture of a copier. When I was a director of an institute, okay, I didn't have to deal with the copiers myself, but the housing services of my university had a contract. What did happen? The copier company made a contract with the university and said, we put a copier in the place in the Institute of Arnold Tukker, and you pay us for each copy that is being made. We have internet connection between the copier and the factory, so you could see basically how the copier was used. Interestingly, the firm could see how much A4, how much black and white, how much color, how much AP, whatever. They could see exactly how much we printed and how we used the copier, which was great marketing intelligence for the company. They couldn't know that in another way. They could do maintenance and control at distance. They could see if certain components were still working well in the copier or not. And even before the copier would break down, they would bring a new copier and take the old one back. Yeah, and we would pay for the amount of copies that we would make. The copier goes back to the factory. They take out all the components that they see that they can reuse in a new model. Let's say the glass sheet. Let's say the rolling system by which you transport paper. Maybe not the little cell that makes photos to make copies, because that has been improved, of course, after 5 years. And you put a new nice casing around it. And it looks like a new copier. And nobody knows that inside 80% of the components are actually secondhand. And you put the copier again in a different company in the same model. You can imagine if you can reuse 80% of your own materials for free, that is so much basically gains. This is a new business model. At this moment, the copier company, actually, they don't care how long the materials or the copiers last, as long as I make copies, because that is how I pay them. Actually, they don't have an interest that the copier is obsolete after 3 years. If the copier only, lives 6 years and I'm happy with it, they have to use less materials. They have less production cost. So this is something that goes to more intensive use as well. Then the consumption perspective. A very difficult table, but what we did there, we compared a lot of studies, how people like you and me spend our money. And we looked at how the spending of our money leads to environmental impacts. And what we then said is that, most of the carbon emissions, they are related to food, to our houses, electrical equipment, and transport. 80%. That is basically okay. Water extraction, not surprisingly, is mainly related to food. Land use, mainly related to agriculture. The materials are mainly related to the houses that we live in. So the point is that if we can improve our habits in using food, improves our habits around transport, housing, and electric equipment, yeah, then we probably can reduce a lot of emissions. So how can we do that? Let's talk about food. If you go to low meat diets, the problem is that if you have 1 kilogram of beef, you probably need to feed a cow with 5 kilograms of grains. Well, that and the grains are produced with a lot of water use and land use and so on. So low meat, vegetarian and vegan diets actually help to reduce land use and water use an enormous amount. Well, that looks a little bit like counterintuitive, and I'm not going to say that you shall not eat meat. But I think my parents or my grandfathers, they had maybe 2 times meats a week, yeah? And they were healthy. There was nothing wrong with it. I'm not going to say that you can live meatless or something like that. But I also know from experience, I just come from China, that there, the usual Chinese restaurant, you have these big rotating tables, shrimps and other things. It's all meat-based. And then all of a sudden we went to a restaurant that was Buddhist and that only had meat-free stuff. And they had made it in such a way that I did not really have a different experience. I really felt as pleased with the taste and the texture and whatever. And I think, yeah, why? I mean, if I can stay healthy with maybe eating 5 times a week like that, and only 2 times a day meat, then you really reduce your impact really a lot. Let's now go to transport. Well, not all solutions that we have in the Netherlands will apply here, but let's assume that you have good public transport. One of the reasons I don't have a car is that I live very close to a railway station. I travel in 15 minutes to Leiden, where I work, and I take a bike, and in 25 minutes I'm in my office. The public transport works on the train on renewable electricity, so that is actually 0 carbon emissions. Yeah. What you also want to have is bike and pedestrian friendly cities. I'm not going to say that it will work in Indonesia. It's probably too hot. But I would say pedestrian friendly. I'm not sure if you walk in Jakarta, you want to go just across the street. I mean, it's almost impossible to come from the airport to your next hotel, even though it's very close. You need to have a cab. Yeah. And then I think I also was in Paris for a while. In Paris, I think car-based transport was dominant 10, 15 years ago. They even made a highway across the Seine River. Yeah. What they did at some point, also during COVID, they closed a lot of lanes for car traffic, and they made it basically for biking. They closed the highway along the River Seine. And for some reason, people now see that actually with the bike, and Paris, of course, is a cooler climate, so you can easily bike there. You're quicker than by car. Yeah, distances are not too big. 5 kilometers, let us say 20 kilometers biking. They have a very good metro system there, so if you do longer distances, you prefer the metro. If you want to park your car, it's impossible in Paris. And what also happened is that the highway across the river now is a very nice place to have a nice coffee, to have a drink with friends and so on. So actually Paris has become much more livable, a much better place by kicking out the cars. So killing 2 birds in 1 stone. It's a much nicer place to live now, and you reduce a lot of the emissions related to transport. What you also have to do is reduce flying. I'm the culprit. I fly too much. Housing, I already talked about. Natural cooling, well insulated, heat pumps. But also, I mean, if you look at Donald Trump, did you ever see that he had somewhere in Florida this huge mansion? He is never there, maybe two months a year. I think the mansion has 100 rooms. I think, yeah, maybe you can say, well, maybe it is good enough if each person has a private space of 15, 20 square meters with your family, you have a common room and that kind of things. And then you reduce the amount Or you maximize the amount of square meters per person. You don't have to cool it, you don't have to heat it. And another important thing is you have to build flexible for a long time. The Chinese do it totally wrong. You know, you have a place here, they built a very crappy building 20 years ago. The ground price goes up. They demolish the crappy building, build a higher building, the ground price again goes up, and 20 years later you demolish it again. That is not what you want. What you want is that you think about if you, for instance, now build office space or if you built it in the past. We see that thanks to COVID, we are now much more used to actually work remotely. And you see that the amount of office space that we need is going down. Well, why not convert that into housing? You know, think about these kind of things. What's happening? Now, I think I just continue and hope it works. I should still have it. No, it should be good. Hey. It works. Well. I cannot even close it. It doesn't listen. You know? Do what? Now we stop it. Yeah. And now we have to join again. Meeting. The same thing. Computer audio or not? Yeah. Okay. En nou. Nou, huppata. Ja, wat is die weer? Hier, weg. It's there. Oh my goodness. Okay, I hope that everybody can follow me. Oh, no. Okay. And sorry for the delay. Okay, I was just about housing. And of course, electrical equipment, I mean, we cannot say a lot about what we buy. I mean, there is now a lot of regulation that wants to make sure that the computers we buy, the television screens we buy, use a low amount of electricity. Then I want to talk you through, and that has to go very quick. It's 5 slides left, so I hope I can finalize that quite soon, despite being over time. It is the method of environmental input-output analysis, and I will show you a little bit how that can help with some other things. Input-output analysis, input-output tables of, say, for Indonesia, and Victor and other PhDs of me use that. They divide the economy of a country in about 100 sectors. Say agriculture, let's say, and then different types of agriculture. Mining, different types of mining. Industrial production in different industries, the service sectors, and so on. What an input-output table does is that, for instance, if you have, what is it, the vegetable oil sector, they have an input from the oilseed sector, like palm oil. Yeah, and there the input is crushed and you create palm oil. The palm oil goes to the food industry, made all kind of food stuff of it. So an input-output table indicates how you basically have an input in one sector produced by other sectors and where the output of a certain sector goes. And you can do that at a global scale. Yeah, you can combine the input-output tables of many countries and then see if you have palm oil from Indonesia. Yeah, maybe that goes to a producer in India and use it, you know, put it there in stuff, or in China. So it's a lot of work to make these tables, but we have done that, and you can actually then link all of a sudden production with consumption. So let's assume that Victor and I go to a very expensive Starbucks and we pay the equivalent of €10 for a few coffees. Then, of course, half of the money is used for the people that run the Starbucks, you know, the people who serve you, the owner, and that kind of thing. So let's say €5, 50,000 rupiah stays there. But Starbucks has to buy coffee from a coffee roaster. Well, maybe a few euros go to the coffee roaster to make the coffee that is being used in Starbucks. There is maybe €1 needed for transport. There is somewhere a farmer that produces the coffee that also needs to get money. And okay, there he goes again. No, I think he doesn't share the screen anymore. for some reason. Okay, I just continue, and I'm very sorry for the people online that you probably cannot follow it fully. But Victor, I sent the presentation to you, so maybe share it with all the people, and I just continue because otherwise you lose too much time. So basically what happens is that the 10 euro I spent is now reallocated to the food of the restaurant sector in Indonesia that gets 5 euros. Let's say the food industry that produces the coffee, a few euros, the transport sector, €1, and the farmer sector, €1. But in an environmental input-output table, I also know what the emissions per euro turnover are per sector. So if I know that, for instance, the Starbucks doesn't have a lot of emissions, they have maybe an air conditioning or something like that. Yeah. Okay, let's say that is a few hundred gram per euro spent. Where in the agricultural sector, it is a kilogram per euro that they earn. All of a sudden, I can allocate how much CO2 emissions is related to my expenditure of 10 euros. That is the idea about these input-output tables. And now we can do very nice calculations with it, like this. Here I rank something like 50 countries with the carbon emissions per capita of what basically how they spend their money. And you see it's difficult to read, but on the top, it doesn't matter if it's for carbon, that's pink, water, land use, materials. You see that countries like the US, Australia, they're always on top, And that is because they spend a lot of money. They are rich. But let's go one step further. I also mapped the environmental impacts versus human development index. And then you see something like this, and that is very exciting. Like I said already a few times in this talk, if you live in a country where there's not a lot of money, like in Africa, then of course your human development index is low. You have low emissions because you don't have a lot of money. You cannot spend a lot of stuff. But what is interesting here, you see there are a cluster of countries that roughly is a 10-ton per capita carbon emissions, and they have a very good human development index. That are the Western European countries, like my country, France, Sweden. And they have countries that actually have no better human development index, but they have double the CO2 emissions. That is the US, that is Australia, and a few other ones. And what you see there is actually that these countries are quite inefficient in giving their people a good life for the amount of money they have and the amount of CO2 that they generate. And that goes back to what I said about the US. The US is a country with huge income differences. The US is a country where if you want to go to a good university, you pay easily $50,000, $60,000 a year. If I would have kids, I couldn't pay it. I have a very good income in my country. I cannot pay that, yeah? So I would be in the upper middle class and I cannot send my kids to college, yeah? Which is weird. But okay, that's how the US works. If you look at the health insurance in the US, it is so expensive that 20% of the people don't have health insurance. They don't have access to good health care. Well, then go back to the Human Development Index. What determines a good Human Development Index? That is the amount of years that you can go to school. That is your lifetime expectancy, which is related, of course, to good healthcare and also, I would say, good lifestyle, and your income. I really hope that Indonesia is doing better than that people can go to good universities like UNPAD just because they're clever and not because the parents have a lot of money. Yeah. So yeah, you see here that the way how you organize your society and the way how you divide money actually implies if you can give a lot of people a good life with a relatively low amount of emissions, or that you need a lot of emissions and still give your people not a good life. So almost I entered the domain of politics. Yeah, I'm talking about let's create an equal society, a society that is a bit fair, and that distributes income in a fair way, that makes the threshold to education and healthcare not too high. That is important. So, 3 slides to go. If we want to improve the world and get this, I would say, let's say, society where people have a good life while staying within planetary limits, we have to do a few things. Of course, we have to clean production. We have to reformulate our energy system. We have to go to PV, wind, and so on. We have to have sustainable design, that we can reuse these kind of things many times. We have to, let's say, intensify use and go to sustainable business models. But we also have to shift our consumption that is less material intensive. So it would be a good thing that I become, let's say, 5 days a week a vegan person. That what I already do, that you use public transport and much less cars, that I fly less. Yeah, so a few things like that. But it's also a societal challenge. You have to organize your society in such a way that actually the money that you have and the environmental resources that you have are distributed in a relatively equal way, and that you then can have actually a good quality of life for many people without a lot of environmental impacts. And I think if you really look at what these options can bring, you really can go a long way. I mean, if you improve production, if you make the lifetime of these kind of things, all the products that we have, twice times as good. If you reduce the amount of emissions in a country by actually, like you see, the difference between Europe and the US, where you have half the emission per capita and actually an equally good life, then all of a sudden you see by organizing your society, you win a factor 2, maybe a factor 3. By designing your product smarter, you win a factor 2, a factor 3. And then by switching to clean energy systems and whatever, you also win a few factors. All of a sudden, together, you have improvements of a factor 10, 50 to 50. And that are the kind of improvements that totally at the beginning of my talk, we needed. So we can do this. Yeah. But we have to reuse all the options that we have. And we also have to recognize that we cannot grow the economy forever and that we have to go to a steady state economy. So thanks for your attention. I overshot time a little bit. I'm sorry for that. But I hope you can, if you have questions, it's okay to do that. And hopefully we can close them maybe in.
Okay, so for anyone's in this room and for anyone's in Zoom, is there any questions? Okay. For the Zoom. Okay. Okay, so is there any question for the people in the Zoom or in this room? Anyone? Okay, okay. So there's one question from this room. Please introduce yourself and what is your question?
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Puji. So my question is related to the agriculture, like you have said about urban farming or some technology. As we know, agriculture in Indonesia is still traditional. Most of the farmers still have low education. So how to accelerate this process to be a greener farmers, something like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, you say farmers have low education. That's probably true. Yeah, I think there maybe are a few things. I think education is important. And I think as well in my country, maybe until 100 years ago or 80 years ago, there was traditional farming. There were no real schools for it. But then particularly after the Second World War, actually, we were not a very big food producing country. As you may know, in the Second World War, we had actually famine. People died, and it was a huge incentive to improve agriculture in the Netherlands. So we started to set up agricultural schools. The farmers went to schools. That was not super intensive. It was maybe 3 years, 4 years, or something like that for relatively young people as a professional education. So that is maybe one part that you can do. And then, of course, I'm not at all an agricultural specialist, but yeah, I would say that that is something. Then, of course, if you have good agricultural specialists and they can teach them how to do sustainable farming, I think that is important. There is a more dark side to it. What we see is that not the farmers, but there is a whole industry behind it that is really powerful, makes a lot of money, and they have an interest to sell farmers pesticides, fertilizers, and all these kind of things. And then you see on a different level the same situation as what happens with my trousers. The more they can sell, the more money they make. So these kind of big industries, they don't have too much of an interest in sustainable farming, if I'm very good. So you have to balance that. You have to really empower almost farmers to say, well, I can do it in a different way. There are very nasty things that if you now plant certain seeds, I think, I'm not a farmer, but let's say normally you would have grain, you would put it in the ground, and you would have a new harvest, and you would put 10% of seeds aside for actually seeding it in the next year. As a farmer, you were in control. What you now have is high yield seeds, and they are manipulated in such a way that you cannot actually get it back and leave it for half a year and then throw it back in the ground. But you have to go again to the seller of the seeds, yeah, and they of course then manipulate the prices, that kind of thing. So there are all kind of nasty things going on in the agricultural sector that you have to prevent, and you have to do that via legislation, I'm afraid. Yeah, I think that are two things that you have to take into account. So it is education on the one hand, and on the other hand, making sure that sustainable farming can be done despite the fact that are very much like in the fossil industry, Shell is against renewable energy because they cannot have a business in. You have to protect your system against that kind of influences. And maybe a last word about urban farming. Actually, when I was a young kid, my parents had their own little garden. Yeah, and they lived in the rural countryside. Okay, fine. And that paid off because, it was a kind of a hobby and it wasn't too intensive. But you also see that urban farming often is labor intensive and capital intensive. So I cannot really see at the moment. I mean, and again, I'm not an agricultural economist, but maybe it is too expensive at the moment. I don't know. You have to take all these kind of things into account. I hope this helps a little bit.
Okay, is there any question? One more question, maybe? Okay. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, Mr. Tukker. I'm Nuska. It's great to have the opportunity to hear your explanation. As you explained about the new growth industry, such as PV that use nickel ore. And as we know, in Indonesia, there's a downstream policy that is the focus of the government. And I want to know about your view, Mr. Tukker, on nickel downstream in Indonesia regarding its impact on the environment in the future, and how to optimize the benefit of downstream while maintaining environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Yeah, I think frankly that is the way to go. If you see what China did very cleverly, 10, 20 years ago or 20 years ago, their industry was actually not giving the best quality. Whatever, we could still compete in the West. Then in the West, we thought we're going to compete more on services and that kind of things. China actually expanded their industry. They have a huge home market. So they actually can now make PV cells. They can make high-speed trains. I think better than in Europe. And there is a company, BID, that makes electric cars and electric buses. It didn't exist 15 years ago. Yeah. they have created such a market in China because China was the cities were so polluted that the only way out to reduce pollution was to make sure that you switch to electric vehicles and electric buses. China has a huge policy that if I was in Shanghai, if you have a petrol car like Victor, you can use it only every other day. Yeah. If you have an electric car, you can use it every day. Guess what people buy? Electric cars, of course. And, you know, we in the West were kind of sleeping. If there was a rule like that, you know, the car owners would say, no, I want to use my car every day. You know, the law was blocked and blah, blah. We didn't even consider it politically not viable. And you know what happens at the moment? There is now all of a sudden an auction for buying new buses in Belgium. You know who was winning? The Chinese, of course, because they know how to make large volumes of buses. They went to all the troubleshooting. They can sell it cheap, and our bus manufacturers go bankrupt. So if you in Indonesia see similar opportunities to build a home industry, particularly the innovative industries that you need in the future, and if you look a little bit at my country at the moment, and many countries in Europe, I mean, we get a very conservative government, as we informed as we speak. That implies that we are not going to make the novel technologies. You know, we will rely still on gas. We will, you know, say Shell is good, blah, blah. If your country, your part of the world can say, yeah, but we understand that these and these are technology in the world, and you can actually lure in some investors that say, okay, we're going to make electric cars. We're going to nickel to make electric cars. Victor did a paper on that. Yeah. With luck, you are the winners in the future. Yeah. So I think you really should pursue these kind of opportunities. And that is what I call also with leapfrogging, that you say, well, we know that that kind of industry is kind of fading out. And these are the industries of the future. And then invest in the industries of the future, making of your competitive advantage in your country, which is that you have certain resources like nickel and bronze.
Okay. So that was our last question for our session. And I think to summary up for this session, basically we live in our earth and we do have challenges in our earth because our habits and behavior. That's why we have to change our habits and behavior in a sustainability way, which is if we see it as a sustainable triangle that has environment, society, economic, or there's a lot of people, or there's some people also say as the profit, planet, and people. Still, at the top of the pyramid is the environment. So that's why we as a human, we as a Homo sapiens, we have to live in a sustainability way. So I think for today, I think I'm going to close it, Professor, for this session. Is there any further words you want to say?
You were a very nice audience, very quiet. I was happy, but I was happy that at least some questions came. And I would recommend you really be a bit more open, you know, a bit more active and whatever. If you have a next guest speaker and whatever. But very nice. Thank you.
Okay. So let's end this session. Thank you for your participation. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Yeah, and also thank you for the people online. And sorry that the last 5 minutes became a bit of a mess, but the program did. Okay, see you. Bye bye.